Thanks for listening to this episode of History's Greatest Battles. There are some battles that I approach with hesitation. Their national significance, their proximity to our day, and even some with a degree of personal attachment, having had great uncles serve in the Pacific Theater during World War II. These things all make me hesitant to relay with the best of my abilities the battle at hand. I have a friend who is both a veteran and a military historian, shortly receiving his PhD in asymmetrical warfare. I asked him about my retelling of the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in the 50s. He told me it was an excellent introduction to what occurred, and I concur. In just 20 or 30 minutes, how can I share the countless individual sacrifices, the terror and the heroism, the squad-based tactics that fed into a larger strategy? I think perhaps the hardest part of each episode is whittling down so much of what is both significant and fascinating to create a concise yet comprehensive overview. And so now, understanding the humility with which I approach this episode, let us experience the Battle of Okinawa.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 1, Episode 31, The Battle of Okinawa, the 1st of April to the 22nd of June, 1945. Forces of the United States, 180,000 men. Forces of Imperial Japan, reported as up to 130,000 men. This invasion stood as the last great offensive of World War II, its staggering cost of blood and sacrifice weighing heavily on the scales, tipping the balance toward the use of atomic weapons to bring the conflict to an end.
Once U.S. forces stormed ashore at Guadalcanal in August of 1942, the relentless tide of American offensives showed no signs of breaking. At the helm of this juggernaut was the indomitable General Douglas MacArthur, who led his army with iron resolve, crushing Japanese forces in the Western Solomons and New Guinea. By September 1944, his gaze fixed upon the Philippines, setting the stage for a battle that would bring him one step closer to Japan's doorstep. Meanwhile, the U.S. Marines carved their own bloody path toward Japan, seizing isolated Japanese bastions one by one in a brutal island-hopping campaign that left no room for retreat or hesitation. This strategy, targeting pivotal islands to command entire regions, gave the Americans the solid foundations they needed to forge an unyielding march across the Central Pacific, tightening their grip with every victory. While MacArthur's forces unleashed hell upon the Philippines, Admiral Chester Nimitz's Marines locked down the Marianas, cementing American dominance over the Pacific. With the Marianas Islands secure, the deadly long-range B-29 bombers were unleashed, carrying the war straight to Japan's heart, reducing its factories to ashes in a campaign of unrelenting fire. In February, American boots hit the black sands of Iwo Jima, a vital foothold in the Bonin Islands, signaling the start of another brutal campaign. By the time of Okinawa, Army forces and Marines united, their separate campaigns converging in a single, thunderous strike against the final stronghold before Japan itself. Okinawa, the largest in the Ryukyu chain, stood as Japan's southernmost bastion, a fortress guarding the empire's vulnerable underbelly. Though Okinawa's people had not been Japanese by birth, their island was brought under Tokyo's dominion by the early 20th century, becoming another piece in Japan's growing empire. For the Americans, Okinawa offered a grim preview, a harrowing glimpse of what awaited them when the day came to invade Japan's home islands. Should the Okinawan civilians mirror the fanatic resistance of Japan's soldiers, the blood price for taking Japan would be unimaginable. Lieutenant General Buckner, abandoning any pretense of stealth, unleashed a furious barrage on Okinawa, determined to break its defenses before a single American soldier set foot on its shores. While Buckner hoped to pulverize the island's defenses, this unrelenting bombardment left U.S. fleets exposed to vicious air raids from Japanese bases in the south. To shield the vulnerable fleets and augment the pre-invasion assault, a formidable armada of aircraft carriers loomed over Okinawa. ready to annihilate any threat from above. The looming threat of airstrikes from Japan hung over the operation, a menace that could strike at any moment. During the brutal fight for the Philippines, the Japanese unveiled their most terrifying weapon yet, the kamikaze, suicidal pilots turning their aircraft into guided missiles of death. These kamikaze pilots, named after the ancient divine wind that obliterated Mongol invaders, were tasked with delivering Japan from foreign domination by tearing American fleets to pieces in fiery collisions. Despite the sheer number of kamikazes hurled at American forces, their attacks in the Philippines and Iwo Jima failed to deliver the catastrophic blows Japan needed to halt the U.S. advance. Yet Japan's swarms of medium bombers still posed a serious threat, capable of wreaking havoc on U.S. forces if left unchecked. Since the days of Hakata Bay, Japan had forged itself into a nation where the military's iron will shaped every aspect of life, infusing the empire with an unshakable devotion to war. In the savage Pacific War from 1941 to 1945, a conflict ruled by navies and by air power, Japan lacked the one weapon it needed most: overwhelming numbers of ships and aircraft. From the outset, Japan's fate was sealed, and no soldier is more desperate than a Japanese warrior staring down inevitable defeat. Ingrained in their very blood was the belief that surrender was unthinkable, that death in service to the emperor was the only acceptable fate, a creed that all but ensured Japan's inevitable plunge into extreme and desperate tactics. In the opening clashes of the brutal Guadalcanal campaign deep in the Solomon Islands, U.S. Marines encountered the savage fury of banzai charges, a raw and reckless onslaught of Japanese soldiers charging straight into death. The roar of banzai, a cry meaning 10,000 years, echoed through the battlefield, not merely a wish for the emperor's long reign, but a vow that his soldiers would sacrifice every breath in his name. What the Marines had witnessed on the ground became airborne terror by 1944, as Japanese pilots with the same fanatical resolve turned themselves into human weapons aimed at the heart of the U.S. fleet. The dawn of the kamikaze terror began in May 1944, when the first recorded suicide attack from the skies struck off the coast of New Guinea, setting a grim precedent for the battles to come. Prime Minister Tojo, fully aware of Japan's shrinking chances, had already sanctioned the creation of special attack units, heralding a new chapter in Japan's deadly gambit. But it wasn't the high command that pushed hardest for these suicidal tactics. It was the junior officers, men who, with Japan's forces pushed to the brink, saw no choice but to resort to these drastic measures in the face of America's overwhelming supremacy in both the air and the sea. By the summer of 1944, Tokyo's Imperial University's Aerial Research Department unveiled its latest creation, the Oka, a rocket-propelled death machine with a warhead packed into its nose, a cruel mockery of its delicate name, Cherry Blossom. The men chosen to pilot these living missiles were dubbed Thunder Gods, warriors of the sky, destined to explode in fire. Yet the Oka was never mass-produced. Only a few hundred rolled off the lines, leaving the bulk of kamikaze missions to bombers and fighters repurposed for their deadly final flights. Their first appearance came in October of 1944 as U.S. forces fought tooth and nail through the Philippines, the kamikazes descending like death from above. Those who volunteered for kamikaze missions did so out of an ironclad sense of duty, and in most cases, they were given ample time to dwell on their fate, as weeks and sometimes months could pass before they were called upon for their final flight. Before each mission, the pilot wrapped a white headband, the hachimaki, around his brow, emblazoned with Japan's rising sun. Many also girded themselves with the seninbari, a ceremonial belt sewn by the hands of 1,000 distinct women, each stitch by each woman a silent prayer for his sacrifice. In solemn ritual, he was given a final cup of water or sake, a parting toast to a life soon to end. Yet not all kamikaze pilots met their end in flames. Some survived, their planes plagued by mechanical failures or misfortune. While some accounts speak of these pilots returning to jeers and disgrace, others suggest that if a worthy target wasn't found, pilots were expected to return and face death another day. By January 1945, with defeat looming large, Japan's military leadership proposed a chilling plan to the emperor, an all-out embrace of suicide tactics across the armed forces. The emperor, however, refused. By February, the flood of early volunteers had slowed to a trickle, forcing Japan to draft pilots into the kamikaze ranks, turning what was once a volunteer death sentence into a mandatory duty. Though kamikaze attacks were sparse during the Iwo Jima campaign of February and March of 1945, the fury unleashed at Okinawa in April was nothing short of overwhelming, as the full might of Japan's suicide squadrons came crashing down on the U.S. forces. Okinawa became a graveyard for the U.S. Navy. The last kamikaze attack struck on August the 13th, mere days before Japan's emperor, seeing the futility of further sacrifice, announced surrender. By the end, 2,525 naval aviators and 1,388 Army pilots had given their lives in the desperate kamikaze assaults, a devastating toll in Japan's final, frantic bid to halt the inevitable. Though the aerial kamikazes dominated the headlines, they were not alone in their deadly purpose. Japan also deployed small, one-way submarines called Kaiten, heaven shifters, designed to strike at U.S. vessels with the vain hope of altering Japan's doomed fate. There were even reports of individual Japanese soldiers strapping themselves with explosives, hurling their bodies onto American tanks to destroy them. But the madness didn't end there. The military had begun devising plans to turn the entire civilian population into a last line of defense. A suicidal force named the Ichioka Toko, 100 million souls, prepared to die for Japan. Many argue that it was only the overwhelming terror of the two atomic blasts in August 1945 that shattered the fanatical sense of duty gripping Japan's people, a force stronger than any conventional weapon could hope to break. As the inevitable U.S. landings drew near, the Japanese military launched an astonishing propaganda campaign, stoking fear and frenzy among the island's inhabitants. Civilians were whipped into a state of panic, convinced that American forces would subject them to unspeakable horrors, torture, rape, mutilation, even the cannibalism of their children. The Marines, they were told, were monsters without mercy. The grotesque demonization of the Americans worked too well. When the invasion began, many families chose to take their own lives, parents killing their children, and then themselves, rather than face the imaginary horrors awaiting them. The American soldiers and Marines found themselves locked in a dual struggle, not only battling the deeply entrenched Japanese garrison, but also waging a psychological war against a terror-stricken civilian population bent on self-destruction. On Easter Sunday, April the 1st, 1945, the U.S. invasion of Okinawa began. American forces stormed the island's western shores, meeting little initial resistance. A deceptive calm before the bloodshed to come. The true strength of the Japanese lay in the island's southern quarter, where rugged terrain and the imposing stronghold of Shuri Castle offered a fortress from which they could launch devastating defenses. The northern three-quarters of Okinawa was sparsely defended, with most of its resistance made up of conscripted Okinawan civilians. In some instances, these civilians fought fiercely, but in far greater numbers, they died by their own hands, driven to suicide by the lies fed to them by their leaders. Many conscripted islanders were stationed alongside Japanese soldiers. They, too, when the tide turned against them, either took their own lives or were executed by their comrades to prevent capture. Within 3 weeks, U.S. forces had secured the northern three-quarters of the island, along with critical airfields, but the remaining southern portion promised a far deadlier contest. Despite a ferocious bombardment from sea and sky, the Japanese suffered surprisingly few losses. The very earth of Okinawa worked in their favor. Its soft soil allowed them to tunnel deep, keeping the bulk of the Japanese 32nd Army hidden beneath the ground. Yet within the ranks of the Japanese command, there was fierce debate on how best to confront the American onslaught. General Mitsuru Ushijima, the island's commander, was torn between two opposing strategies, each fiercely championed by his subordinates. The fiery general Isamu Cho urged a bold, immediate banzai charge, believing that a swift, violent assault could overwhelm the Americans and hurl them back into the ocean. On the other side was Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, who saw the banzai charge as futile madness. Knowing full well it would be slaughter before superior U.S. firepower, he advocated a war of attrition, drawing the Americans into a slow, grinding battle of endurance. Yahara advised them to stay entrenched in their caves and bunkers, creating interlocking fields of fire that would bleed the Americans dry for every inch of ground they dared to take. Initially, Yahara's plan carried the day. Japanese artillery and machine guns were carefully positioned to create deadly crossfire zones, turning the southern part of Okinawa into a deadly maze of overlapping fire. But within 3 days, Ushijima succumbed to Cho's relentless demands for an attack. The offensive was set for April the 4th, but a sudden American diversion near their lines rattled Ushijima, leading him to call off the charge at the last minute. Throughout April, Cho managed to launch several banzai charges, but Yahara's fears proved justified. Each attack led to staggering Japanese losses, achieving nothing but a growing pile of dead. When U.S. forces finally clashed with the entrenched Japanese in the south, the battle ground to a torturous crawl. It resembled the ghastly stalemates of the First World War, soldiers dying by the hundreds for the sake of a few blood-soaked yards. The Japanese dug deep into their caves and bunkers, sprung ambushes at every turn, and their expertly positioned artillery rendered American tanks nearly impotent. U.S. soldiers and Marines were forced to break into small squads, using the jagged terrain for cover as they inched forward, each step forward requiring precision and coordination, always under threat of hidden fire. Only when a cave was captured, or when a desperate band of Japanese defenders abandoned their post in a suicidal attack, could a gap in the enemy's lines be exploited. Once the deadly crossfires were broken, flanking maneuvers could finally be executed, but progress remained painfully slow. It wasn't until July 2nd, after nearly 3 agonizing months of relentless combat, that Okinawa was declared secure. The Americans were forced to root out the Japanese position by position, often resorting to flamethrowers and explosive satchel charges to burn or blast the enemy from their underground layers. This brutal tactic paralyzed the Japanese defenders, leaving them disoriented and defenseless. Bulldozers would then move in, sealing cave entrances with the bodies of the living and the dead alike trapped inside. As expected, the Japanese defenders fought with savage intensity, only to meet their fiery deaths in the depths of caves or beneath tons of earth. Some, refusing to die entombed, took their own lives with grenades or pistols. Others charged headlong into the enemy's fire, seeking one final moment of defiance. For the first time in the entire war, a significant number of Japanese soldiers broke the sacred taboo of surrender, a violation of their military code that had scarcely been seen before. Though the creed of death before dishonor had been adhered to by countless Japanese soldiers, previous invasions saw only a handful of prisoners. But at Okinawa, the horrors of the battlefield drove some 7,400 soldiers to lay down their arms and surrender, a staggering break from tradition. The spirit of self-sacrifice burned brightest in the kamikazes during the battle. Their assaults came not only from the sky, but also from small boats laden with explosives, and from individual soldiers, each carrying death on his back, eager to give his life in one final act of destruction. Even the Yamato, the crown jewel of Japan's once mighty navy, was dispatched on a suicidal mission, but before it could unleash its fury on the U.S. fleet, it was obliterated by American torpedo planes, sinking beneath the waves, a symbol of Japan's naval ruin. Of all the Japanese assaults, the aerial kamikazes proved the most devastating, sinking 33 U.S. ships and crippling over 350 more. The sheer ferocity of the attacks left scars across the American fleet. But even this savage onslaught could not compel a U.S. withdrawal, let alone deliver victory to the Japanese. In the end, their sacrifice was futile. The American war machine was simply too vast, too relentless to be stopped by desperate measures alone. When Okinawa was finally declared secure, it was a hollow victory. The cost almost incomprehensible. Around 150,000 Okinawans had perished, nearly 1/3 of the island's population wiped out in the brutal carnage. Among the dead were 10,000 Koreans conscripted as slave labor by the Japanese military, their lives snuffed out in a war they were forced to serve. Of the roughly 119,000 Japanese soldiers stationed on the island, an astounding 112,000 met their end. Many slain in combat, others entombed forever in the crumbled remnants of caves and bunkers, their fate sealed by the earth itself. Beyond the staggering loss of life, Okinawa's cultural heritage was shattered. The island's towns and villages were reduced to rubble, with few buildings standing after 3 relentless months of devastation. In total, the defenders of Okinawa suffered a death toll greater than that caused by the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined, an unfathomable cost paid in blood. The United States, too, paid dearly. Nearly 13,000 Americans were dead, with close to 8,000 falling on the island itself, and the rest lost at sea. An additional 32,000 were left wounded, bearing the scars of Okinawa's hellish battleground. The staggering loss of life, especially among the Japanese civilians, set off alarm bells in Washington, where leaders grappled with the terrifying cost of future operations. Newly sworn-in President Harry Truman examined the plans for the invasion of Japan's home islands, and the projected casualty figures were nothing short of horrifying. Estimates warned that U.S. casualties could soar to 100,000 men within the first 30 days alone, with a total of up to 1 million dead U.S. soldiers by the campaign's end. As for the Japanese civilians, the death toll would be incalculable. If Japan's civilians fought with even a fraction of the ferocity seen in Okinawa, the home islands would be transformed into a wasteland of charred cities and countless dead, a nightmare literally beyond comprehension. Indeed, much of Japan was already smoldering. Since the previous September, the U.S. bombing campaign had torched vast swaths of the nation's cities, turning them into smoking ruins. Just how much longer Japan could have endured the firebombing is still debated. Some argue that by November, if the incendiary raids continued unabated, the country would have been reduced to a near Stone Age existence, its infrastructure utterly obliterated. But the core issue remained. No one in the West truly knew the situation within Japan. The destruction could be measured, but the strength of their resolve was an enigma. With the slaughter of Okinawa still fresh in his thoughts, Truman was informed of the successful test of the atomic bomb. Without hesitation, he made the fateful decision to use it. That decision, made on August the 6th, 1945, the day Hiroshima was annihilated, has sparked fierce debate ever since. A controversy that began even before the bomb was dropped. What the Allies truly knew about Japan's internal decision-making at the time remains hotly contested. Was Japan quietly crafting a peace offer, despite the Allies' unwavering demand for unconditional surrender since February 1943? If Japan was indeed seeking peace, the question remains, did anyone in the West know about it? The tangled web of who knew what, when they knew it, and how it influenced Truman's decision has sparked endless debate among historians and policymakers alike. Regardless of the political fallout from the atomic bomb, both in the immediate aftermath and in the shaping of the post-war world, there is little doubt that Truman's decision was deeply influenced by the nightmarish fighting he had witnessed at Okinawa. Truman himself, reflecting on the gravity of his choice, wrote, quote, "We'll end the war sooner now, and think of the kids who won't be killed." End quote. As horrific as the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were, the scale of death they wrought was dwarfed by the staggering toll a full-scale invasion of Japan would have exacted on both sides.